Hi, everybody. Sorry, a bit of a late start tonight. As you can see, all a bit in a rush. I've not even had a chance to get out of my kit from work. A little bit late leaving the clinic, but managed to get on here just a little bit later than usual. So apologies for that. As you know, I'm usually here on a Monday at 7 p.m., but my very lovely husband had organised a surprise to go out for Valentine's Day. So clearly that's why I wasn't here last night. Now, I've had one of those days in clinic today, seen some patients generally doing well, progress, etc. The odd person that needed a review. But there was a couple of things that were a very common theme of today, and that was very much people's experience of healthcare. And so really what I wanted to talk about tonight, there's a fabulous new paper come out by a guy called Will King. He actually presented the early results of this study at BESS last year or 2 years ago. And at the time, I congratulated on it because I thought it was such a fantastic piece of work. And as I say, I've had two patients today, both of whom have seen lots of other healthcare practitioners who've all tried to do a fantastic job for them, all tried to get them back on the road to success. But for whatever reason, what they took from that experience was it was all about their pain. It wasn't about them as an individual. They lost faith in the process, and now they're here years down the line, still with problems and still looking for solutions. Now, Will's study, Will King, literally just published in Physiotherapy Theory and Practice in the last couple of days, looks at the lived experience of patients with frozen shoulder. Now, if you have seen patients with frozen shoulder, particularly in those early stages when pain is the predominant symptom, you'll know that often the experience for patients is very, very difficult. Now, Will's study was a qualitative study, in-depth unstructured interviews using an interpretive phenomenological approach. I love that word, phenomenologic, or when I can say it. But essentially, there was 5 key themes that Will found in his study, which again, I think are really important for us to reflect on in terms of truly understanding the patient's journey. So the first theme that came was actually the nature of pain. So how incredibly debilitating this pain was. And so one of the theme headlines was dropping me to my knees. So patients would talk about doing things with their family or being on holiday, and they'd knock their shoulder or somebody would catch their shoulder, and the pain was so excruciating it literally dropped them to their knees. So there was this theme of the severity of pain. Obviously that can have some really fear-inducing and be very nocibic for patients in itself because they're scared there must be something seriously wrong. But again, wanting healthcare professionals to understand just how horrendous that pain is. The second theme was a struggle for normality. So clearly with their pain, the restriction of range of movement, the debilitating sleep disturbance, but also just not being able to engage in normal activities. Again, patients found as one of the major negative things of experiencing this. Now, if you think, certainly when I was a junior physiotherapist, everything that we talked about was where's your pain, what makes it worse, what makes it better. And actually what's clear from studies like Will's, and I'll tell you the other key themes from Will's and then share a couple of others too, is that patients think we don't understand what it is like for them. They seem to think that we consistently underestimate the bigger picture of how that pain impacts their life. So again, from this lovely study from Will, the 5 key themes. The first was dropping to the knees, the severity of pain. The second was struggle for normality because of the very real experience of restriction and functional limitations. And the third one, which is a really common theme when we look at qualitative studies in patients with shoulder pain and other musculoskeletal groups, is the emotional change in self. Now, again, when you look at the language that was used by some of the patients in Will's study, they talk about feeling useless because they can't fulfill their usual role in the family. They might have to sleep in a separate room, so it changes the dynamic with their loved one. They talk about this spiral into depression and the very emotive effects of not being able to engage in their normal, not only their social role at home with their friends, but also potentially the things that they like to do for fun and as their relaxation and as escape. The other thing that is definitely one for us to reflect on, the 4th theme in Will's study, was challenges of the healthcare journey. Now, in frozen shoulder, as you know, even within physiotherapy and healthcare professions, we constantly acknowledge the challenges in terms of there's more we understand about the condition, but there's still lots of unanswered questions in terms of the length of phases, whether these phases are as discrete as we think they are. There's still a lot of uncertainty around the condition. And certainly if you meet somebody very early in their process of a frozen shoulder, where they've got all the pain and the sleep disturbance, but they might not have developed that range of movement restriction, as a clinician, we have to acknowledge a certain level of uncertainty. Well, this is really reflected in Will's study, in which patients said there was a massive challenge in the whole healthcare journey experience that actually amplified the negative experience, if you like, of frozen shoulder. So, for example, they felt fobbed off by the doctor, just take some tablets and come back if it doesn't get better. And of course, if they're in that true frozen shoulder group, the reality is they're probably going to get worse over time. There was this constant theme of seeing people that didn't potentially understand the diagnosis, or they weren't given a diagnosis until further down the line. And so what patients really valued was ultimately when they saw somebody who did understand the condition and actually gave them a treatment that helped. Now, again, what Will's study is really interesting is when you talk to patients, injection was like a lifesaver. It worked wonders, and it was an absolute game changer for a lot of patients. They might have been a bit alarmed by the size of the needle, but fundamentally it made a huge difference in terms of their pain. Now, the thing that was slightly less positive from this study was in terms of patients. Basically, they felt that in the main, sorry, just lost my place on my screen there, in the main, that often physiotherapy wasn't associated with a positive effect, particularly when not in conjunction with injection. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do physio, but I think what's really key from Will's study is they want to see somebody who understands the condition, who can reassure them, that can educate them in a way that gives them some concrete advice or things that they can do. And importantly, understands that bigger experience. So the severity of pain, the struggle for normality, the emotional change in self, and actually does things to make that healthcare journey more positive. So I think patients generally feel there's a lack of information out there, and that perhaps signposting some really good resources, or even making sure we've got better resources, definitely would seem to have a role for these patients, because a lot of what they'll find if they go on Google is not terribly reassuring. Now, interestingly, the final fifth theme was around coping and adapting. And what was clear from Will's study is that healthcare journey, that lack of information, that lack of reassurance, that lack of a intervention that made a difference, also made coping and adapting and dealing with the condition very difficult. Now, the overall theme of this whole study was the fact that patients felt they were living with uncertainty and in kind of no man's land, if you like, in terms of that huge importance and effect it had on their sense of self. Now, I thoroughly recommend reading Will's paper. I'll post a link on the Facebook page because it really is worth a read, and some of the quotes from the patients are just fantastic in terms of really illuminating that patient's experience. But there's another study that's come out recently by Ulak et al. 2022, and this was patients living with shoulder pain. So this wasn't just a frozen shoulder group. So you could be forgiven thinking those 5 themes I've just shared with you. We know frozen shoulder, the pain of frozen shoulder, certainly when you look at comparative studies, suggests that it is one of the worst in terms of the pain that patients experience, and certainly in terms of sleep disturbance. However, in Ulak's study, looking at patients with shoulder pain, again, there were 5 key themes. The first was how debilitating sleep disturbance was, and we know both in terms of functioning, in terms of mood, in terms of mental health, but also pain sensitivity, sleep disturbance has a massive impact on life generally. Again, there was this theme of the impact on function and not being able to do one's usual role, whether that was socially or whether that was somebody's work, and just their baseline ability in terms of just getting dressed and doing their activities of daily living. But again, within this Ulak study was that constant theme of the lack of self, how those changes in ability to do your normal everyday role actually made people lose a sense of them. Now, I think that's massively powerful, and that when we're listening to patients tell their story, and obviously I talk about communication a lot, the importance of starting with an open question and just hearing everything that's contributed to why that person's in front of you today, but also what it is like for them, is so powerful in terms of not only identifying the barriers to their recovery, but also importantly validating that bigger picture experience for them. And then importantly, identifying goals that allow them to see that they're going to get back to that self or that person that they perceive that they've lost. And so, not great surprise in that ULAC study, if you think of the sleep, the work life, the lack of baseline ability, the lack of social role, despair was another common feature. So, the impact of those things, that loss of self, then results in these mental health issues. So, you can see the longer somebody's been living with something, it's really important that we tease those things out in terms of cause and effect. Now, there are a couple of other studies. There was one by Jones in 2013, which was also about patients with frozen shoulder. We had one from Catherine Mims-Lowe, which was in patients in the UK cuff study, which was patients with rotator cuff tears. And again, I think really my key theme for this evening is all these qualitative studies tend to suggest patients feel we as healthcare professionals do not understand how grim it is for them in terms of their pain. So yes, we see comments about the nature of pain. So remember the dropping me to my knees, as in Will's lovely paper, but inexplicable pain, not getting reassurance and an explanation that resonates with them drives that concern about the pain, and it must be something serious. And then getting very fearful for the future because that uncertainty around it means that you don't really know what's going to happen in the future. But then those knock-ons, my life's on hold, I've lost me, anxiety and distress around those different subjects really all illustrate that our job as a healthcare professional, of course, is to be there and help and get people back on a course that gets them back to the things they want to do. But what seems so important from all these studies is to actually acknowledge that wider dimension of the individual pain experience right from the outset. So guys, I'm definitely going to post a link to Will's study because I think it's really well worth a read, and I'll post some links to those other ones as well, because again, they're really reinforcing a common theme that as ever signposts why communication is our superpower, because if we really understand how it is for that person in front of us, then we're well placed to actually help them in the best ways that we can. And sometimes that acknowledgement, that reassurance of just how grim it is and the impact it's had is massively powerful in building that therapeutic alliance. So guys, just a quick one tonight. I'm just going to check we haven't got any questions. Hi Tim, nice to have you here again. No questions. You're being very nice to me tonight. I'm sorry, it was a bit of a last minute rush through the door to get in and share some things. And on the way home, I had actually thought about talking about expectations tonight, and I had that all lined up ready to go. But when I saw Will's paper had come out, I really wanted to signpost it because it's a really lovely way of reflecting on our practice and the things that we can do better. So as ever, I hope you've taken some useful things away. It's just a kind of signpost. Sometimes we need to just sit back and see how debilitating it is in a wider context for our patients. But lovely to have you join me tonight. As I say, just a quick one because I don't want you to think, oh, I'll come back to that, Declan. We've got a question sneaking in there at the end. I don't want to take all your Tuesday night, but as ever, just want to share some key things that make us reflect on our clinical practice and as ever, try and do things better for patients. So Declan's just asked, do you think injections should be recommended in most cases? So Declan, I think that's a great question. And if I'm entirely honest, if I have somebody who comes to see me who's in the right age group with the right mechanism of onset, with pain in the right place, the bottom line is I have a really low threshold to send patients for an intra-articular injection. Purely because I think if you look at the emerging evidence and we start looking more at primary care studies rather than the secondary care studies that have really guided practice in frozen shoulder and potentially given us an overly negative view, if you like, of frozen shoulder, actually there seems to be some evidence that if people get an early injection, then a significant percentage are managed well in primary care and don't go on to need any further intervention in secondary care. So, Declan, in answer to your question, yes, I think in most cases, injection would definitely be up there in one of my first-line treatments in somebody with a true frozen shoulder. Now, in terms of mechanism of effect, there's no doubt it down-regulates some of that transition from fibroblast to myofibroblast. It reduces some of the population. So it does seem to have an effect on the disease process itself. But also in the early stages, we know we have some element of inflammation when we develop that contracture in the rotator interval and the coracohumeral ligament. So I think from my perspective, injection is definitely one of my first line treatments. If somebody can't sleep, they've got that pattern of increasing stiffness, their pains around that deltoid insertion, that deltoid region, maybe with some deltoid insertion pain, and it fits all the other descriptions of a frozen shoulder. So thank you very much for your question, Declan. That was great. Oh, Mina and Hilda being very lovely. Alison, I've recently developed a frozen shoulder. It's definitely made me reevaluate my clinical practice. Oh, Alison, thank you for joining us. And you know what? Isn't that the case? It's really funny because I've obviously stopped my job in the NHS and I've been doing a lot more desk work, trying to catch up with my very long to-do list. I've had neck and back pain. And what is the only difference? I'm spending a whole lot more time sitting. And I've realized how difficult it is to get up regularly and move, because once you get stuck into something, you get real, before you know it, 3 hours have gone. So I love that, Alison. And I think that put you as a clinician experience that. I'm really sorry you're going through that. But there's absolutely no doubt when you then look at the next patient you see with that, it's going to make your interaction very, very different. So thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, guys, 15 minutes. I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much, Declan, for your question. For the rest of you, thank you so much for your lovely comments. As ever, I just hope you've taken away some nice, simple clinical kind of reflections, I guess, tonight, really, just to truly understand that patient experience and remind us it's not all just about the pain. So bye for now, and I shall look forward to being back in my normal slot on a Monday at 7 o'clock next Monday. See you then. Bye for now.